The air in courtroom 3B was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and cheap desperation. On one side sat Blake Morrison, a man tailored in victory, a predator enjoying the final moments before the kill. His smirk was a permanent fixture, a cruel slash in his handsome face that he aimed directly at the woman opposite him. That woman was Madelyn, his ex-wife. She looked small in her worn-out blazer, a ghost haunting the feast of her own demise. He thought this was his final triumph, the last turn of the screw to utterly crush her. He thought wrong. The smirk was his armor, but in a few moments a single sentence from the judge would tear it and his entire world to shreds. The courtroom was a sterile beige box designed to drain all color and hope from those who entered its doors. For Madelyn, sitting on a hard wooden bench that felt carved from ice, it was the final stage of her public execution. Across the aisle, Blake Morrison radiated an aura of success that was suffocating. His suit was a custom-made Tom Ford, his shoes were gleaming, John Lobbs in the watch on his wrist. A Patek Philippe was worth more than the tiny apartment Blake had so graciously allowed her to keep. He wasn't just a man, he was a monument to his own success, a success Madelyn had foolishly believed was once theirs. He leaned over to his lawyer, a silver-haired shark named Walter Harding, and whispered something. They both chuckled, a low rumbling sound that echoed in the cavernous silence of the room. The sound crawled over Madelyn's skin, raising goosebumps. She stared straight ahead, her gaze fixed on the judge's empty bench, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Her own lawyer, Jessica Riley, a young, earnest woman fresh out of law school, patted her hand reassuringly. It was a kind gesture, but it did little to calm the frantic hummingbird of her heart. Jessica was a public defender, fiercely intelligent but hopelessly outgunned. Harding's firm, Harding, Steel & Finch, was legendary. They didn't represent clients. They purchased verdicts. All rise, the bailiff's voice boomed, and Judge Margaret Coleman swept in her black robes, flowing behind her like a harbinger of doom. She was a woman in her 60s with a face that looked as though it had been carved from granite, her eyes missing nothing. She settled into her chair, the leather groaning in protest, and surveyed the room. Her gaze lingered for a moment on Madelyn, then on Blake, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "We are here to rule on the civil suit, Morrison versus Grant." The judge began, her voice crisp and devoid of emotion. "Mr. Morrison alleges defamation and emotional distress stemming from a series of online articles written by Ms. Grant, his former spouse. Mr. Harding, your closing argument, please." Harding rose smoothly to his feet. He was a master of performance, his voice a carefully modulated instrument of persuasion. "Your Honor, this is a simple case. My client, Mr. Blake Morrison, a pillar of the business community, a man who has built a formidable empire from the ground up, has been viciously and publicly attacked by the defendant." He gestured towards Madelyn, his hand slicing through the air. Ms. Grant, embittered by a divorce in which she was treated more than fairly, decided to take her revenge. She published a blog thinly veiled as a journey of self-discovery, where she detailed a relationship with a so-called tyrant. She spoke of emotional manipulation, of being stifled and controlled. While she never used his name, the details were specific enough, the timeline so perfectly aligned, that anyone in their social or professional circle would know exactly who she was talking about. Blake nodded gravely, playing the part of the wounded victim. Madelyn's stomach churned. The blog, Phoenix Rising, had been her lifeline. After the divorce, she'd been a shell. Writing was the only way she could piece her shattered identity back together. She'd written about her feelings of worthlessness, her struggle to find her voice again. It was never about revenge, it was about survival. "These writings," Harding continued, his tone dripping with disdain, "have caused my client significant professional harm. Deals have been questioned. His reputation for integrity has been sullied. He has suffered sleepless nights, anxiety, all because his ex-wife chose to air her vindictive fantasies in a public forum." Madelyn wanted to scream. Sleepless nights Blake slept the untroubled sleep of a man with no conscience. She was the one who woke up shaking from nightmares of his cold, dismissive voice telling her she was nothing. He is not seeking to punish Ms. Grant. Your Honor? Harding said, his voice softening into a mask of compassion. He is seeking to protect his name, his livelihood. We are asking for a public retraction, the immediate removal of the blog, and compensatory damages of $250,000. Jessica leaped to her feet. Objection, Your Honor. The damages are punitive and wildly disproportionate. Ms. Grant has no assets, a fact Mr. Morrison is well aware of. This isn't about compensation, it's about harassment. Sustained, the judge said, her eyes narrowing at Harding. The defendant's financial status is a matter for a later stage. Stick to the facts, Mr. Harding. Harding gave a slight deferential bow, but a smug look passed between him and Blake. They didn't care about the money. They knew she didn't have it. This was about power. It was about proving that even now, divorced and living separate lives, he still controlled her. This lawsuit was the final nail in her coffin, a public declaration that Blake Morrison always wins. As Harding continued his speech, weaving a tapestry of lies that portrayed Blake as a saint and her as a venomous shrew, Madelyn felt a familiar wave of despair wash over her. This was how it had been in the divorce proceedings. Her reality had been twisted and reshaped by expensive lawyers until she no longer recognized it. Blake had the money, the power, the connections. She had the truth, but in a world like theirs, the truth was a currency with no value. She risked a glance at him. He caught her eye and his smirk widened. It was a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. It said, "See, I told you. You are nothing without me, and I will enjoy grinding you into dust." Madelyn took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing the air into her tight lungs. She remembered a promise she had made to herself months ago, sitting in the sterile quiet of a new and lonely apartment. She had promised herself she would never let him see her break again. She held his gaze, her expression unreadable, her posture straight. His smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, surprised by her lack of a visible reaction. He expected tears. He expected fear. He had built his entire case, his entire life since their separation, around the idea of her weakness. But as she sat there under the weight of the court's judgment and his palpable scorn, Madelyn wasn't thinking about her weakness. She was thinking about a quiet afternoon in a sunlit garden, a gentle hand holding hers and a voice deep and kind that had told her, "Your strength is not in your victory over him, my dear. It's in your survival of him." And she had survived. The man across the aisle just didn't know it yet. Their life together hadn't started in a courtroom or a boardroom. It had started in a cramped college library over lukewarm coffee and shared textbooks. Blake Morrison back then wasn't a titan of industry. He was a scholarship kid with a ferocious ambition that burned in his eyes. Madelyn Grant was an art history major with a quiet talent and a belief in beautiful things. He was drawn to her calm, her steady presence, a balm to his own restless energy. She was drawn to his fire, his absolute certainty that he was destined for greatness. They married a year after graduation in a small courthouse ceremony with a handful of friends. Their first apartment was a fifth-floor walk-up in a less than fashionable part of the city, with pipes that rattled and a view of a brick wall. But it was theirs. Madelyn filled it with color-painting vibrant canvases that she sold at local art fairs. Blake was working on a business plan, an idea for a tech logistics company that everyone said was impossible. Everyone but Madelyn. She believed in him with a purity that bordered on religious. When he needed seed money, she sold a painting that had won a prestigious award, the one piece she had sworn she would never part with. She used the money, nearly $10,000, to buy him a new computer and incorporate his business, Morrison Logistics. She took a job as a waitress, then a paralegal, working 60-hour weeks to pay their bills while he worked day and night to get his dream off the ground. She typed his proposals, designed his first logo, and made coffee for his early unimpressed investors. "We're a team, Maddie," he would say, pulling her into his arms, his face tired but alight with passion. "When I make it, we make it. Everything I have will be yours." And for a while it felt like that. The first big contract was a cause for wild celebration. He took her to a fancy restaurant, the kind with white tablecloths and tiny forks, and promised her a future where she would never have to worry about money again. A future where she could quit her job and just paint. That was the dream he sold her, and she bought it wholesale. The success came faster than either of them had imagined. Morrison Logistics exploded. The tiny office became a full floor in a downtown skyscraper. The walk-up apartment was traded for a sprawling condo with panoramic city views. Blake started appearing in business magazines. His name became synonymous with innovation and ruthless efficiency. And somewhere along the way, the we became I. It was a slow erosion, a gradual shift Madelyn barely noticed at first. His late nights at the office became more frequent. His business trips grew longer. The team dinners she used to be a part of were now boys' nights, with investors and executives. When she tried to talk to him about her art, his eyes would glaze over. "That's nice, honey," he'd say, scrolling through emails on his phone. "Listen, I need you to handle the caterers for the shareholder party on Friday. Make sure you get that caviar from Petrosian, the good stuff." Her life became about supporting his. She was no longer a partner. She was an accessory, a high-level event planner and household manager. The paintbrushes gathered dust in a corner of their pristine, minimalist home. There was no room for the mess of creation in Blake's perfectly curated world. Her opinions, once his guiding star, were now interruptions. When she questioned a particularly callous business decision, he looked at her with cold surprise. "Maddie, please," he sighed, loosening his tie. "You don't understand this world. Just trust me. I know what I'm doing." The man who had once cherished her mind now treated her like a child. The final brutal blow came not as a single strike but as a death by 1,000 cuts. It was the condescending tone he used in front of their friends, the way he would correct her stories, making her sound foolish and forgetful, the way he would dismiss her feelings as her being too emotional or dramatic. He was gaslighting her, dismantling her sense of self, piece by piece, until she began to believe it herself. She became quieter, more hesitant, a pale reflection of the vibrant woman she had once been. The affair was almost a cliché. His new assistant, a young woman named Tiffany, who looked at him with the same blind adoration Madelyn once had. Madelyn discovered it by accident, a hotel receipt left in a suit pocket, a text message that flashed on his phone screen while he was in the shower. When she confronted him, there was no remorse. There was only annoyance. "Honestly, Madelyn, what did you expect?" he said, standing before the vast window of their condo, the city lights glittering behind him like a cold diamond backdrop. "We've grown apart. I've grown, and you haven't." "I supported you, Blake." She whispered the words like glass in her throat. "I gave up everything for you for this." He turned to her, and the look on his face was one she would never forget. It was not anger, not sadness. It was pity. "You didn't give up anything, Maddie. You had a little hobby. I gave you a life you could never have dreamed of. You should be grateful." That was the moment the love died. In its place, a cold, hard resolve began to form. She would not be a footnote in the story of Blake Morrison. She would not be his grateful, discarded pet. He had built his empire on the foundation she had laid for him, and then he had tried to bury her beneath it. But he had made one critical miscalculation. He thought he had buried a victim. He had actually planted a seed. The divorce was a masterclass in cruelty. Blake, armed with the legal might of Harding, Steele, and Finch, waged a war of attrition. He was determined not just to end their marriage, but to erase Madelyn's contribution to it entirely. He claimed Morrison Logistics was his creation alone, the result of his singular genius. Her initial seed money was reframed as a small personal loan that had been paid back tenfold in the lavish lifestyle he provided. Her years of support were dismissed as the expected duties of a wife. Their assets were frozen. The joint credit cards were canceled overnight, leaving Madelyn stranded at a grocery store, her cart full, her face burning with shame as the cashier announced the decline to the growing line behind her. Blake's legal team filed motion after motion, burying Jessica, her overworked public defender, in a mountain of paperwork designed to drain her resources and her will. Their mutual friends, the people who had celebrated their wedding and shared holidays in their home, quickly chose sides. Blake hosted lavish dinners where he painted Madelyn as unstable and greedy. He told them she was demanding an unreasonable settlement, that she was trying to destroy the company they all had a stake in. His lies were backed by wealth and influence. Her truth was whispered in a small, empty apartment. The calls stopped. The invitations dried up. She was a social pariah. The battle for the condo was particularly brutal. It was their home, the place she had painstakingly decorated, the only space that still held faint echoes of their happier years. Blake argued it was a corporate asset essential for entertaining clients. He won. She was given 48 hours to pack her personal belongings and leave. Walking through the silent, cavernous rooms, packing her life into cardboard boxes, was the loneliest experience of her life. She touched the frame of a photo from their early days, their faces young and full of hope, and felt a profound, hollow ache. This wasn't just a divorce. It was an amputation. Blake was cutting her out of his life and taking their entire shared history with him. The final settlement was a joke. The judge, swayed by Harding's polished arguments and mountains of doctored financial documents, awarded her a small lump sum payment and 1 year of alimony. It was just enough to ensure she wouldn't be homeless, but not enough to ever be comfortable. It was as Blake had intended, a pittance, a dismissal. He had expected her to crumble. And she did for a time. The first few months were a blur of tears and cheap wine in a tiny one-bedroom apartment across town. The silence was deafening. She was 34 years old, with a huge gap in her resume, no recent artistic portfolio, and a name that was now associated with a bitter public divorce. It was during this dark period that she started the blog. She needed an outlet, a place to scream into the void. She called it Phoenix Rising, a name that felt more aspirational than true. She wrote about the dizzying feeling of losing your identity in a relationship. She wrote about the subtle poison of gaslighting, the slow erosion of self-worth. She wrote about the terrifying, exhilarating process of starting over from scratch. She never once used Blake's name. She never mentioned Morrison Logistics. It was about her journey, her pain, her fight to find the woman she had been before him. The blog found an audience. Women from all over the world started commenting, sharing their own stories of survival. They found solace in her words, and she in turn found strength in their solidarity. She wasn't alone. Then the certified letter arrived. It was a cease and desist from Harding, Steele, and Finch, followed shortly by the summons for the defamation lawsuit. Blake was coming for the one thing she had left her voice. The lawsuit wasn't just malicious, it was strategic. He filed it just as her 1 year of alimony was ending. He knew she would have no money to fight him. He was trying to bankrupt her, to silence her permanently. It was his final declarative act of control. He wanted to prove that even when she was free, she was still his to torment. He was making an example of her. But as Madelyn held the lawsuit in her trembling hands, something inside her shifted. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But beneath it, a different emotion was stirring. It was a slow, burning rage. He had taken her youth, her dreams, her home, and her friends. He would not take this. He would not take her voice. With her alimony gone and legal fees looming, Madelyn knew she needed a job, any job. The problem was the gaping hole in her resume that spanned nearly a decade. She had been Mrs. Blake Morrison, a title that now felt like a brand of shame. After dozens of rejections for corporate and paralegal jobs, she turned back to the one world she truly knew: art. She answered a cryptic online ad for a private collection manager. The ad was vague, listing only an email address and a requirement for absolute discretion. Desperate, she sent her old, dusty resume highlighting her art history degree and her brief experience selling her own work. She didn't expect a reply. A week later, she received an email summoning her for an interview at a location on the Upper East Side. The address was not a company. It was a stately limestone townhouse, discreetly elegant among its neighbors. When the heavy oak door was opened by a stern-looking butler, Madelyn felt a surge of intimidation. She was wearing her only interview outfit, a blazer and skirt from a consignment shop. She was led through hallways that felt more like a museum than a home. The walls were lined with masterpieces, a somber Rothko here, a vibrant Monet there. She recognized a small, exquisite Degas sculpture she had only ever seen in textbooks. Whoever lived here didn't just collect art. They possessed a part of history. In a sun-drenched library overlooking a private garden, a man rose to greet her. He was older than she expected, perhaps in his late 60s, with kind, intelligent eyes that crinkled at the corners. He had a shock of white hair and was dressed in a simple cashmere sweater and trousers, exuding an air of quiet authority. "Ms. Grant," he said, his voice a warm baritone. "Thank you for coming. I am Donovan Pierce." The name meant nothing to her. He wasn't a celebrity or a flashy tech billionaire. He seemed just a man. A very wealthy man, clearly, but unassuming. "Mr. Pierce," she said, shaking his offered hand. It was firm and warm. He gestured for her to sit. "Your resume was intriguing, not for what it says, but for what it doesn't say. There is a 10-year gap followed by a degree in art history from 2 decades ago. Most would discard it. I, however, am a curator of things that others overlook. Sometimes that is where the most value is found." His directness was disarming. Madelyn decided on the truth. "For the last decade, I was married. My life was dedicated to my husband's career." Blake Morrison. Donovan said not as a question, but as a statement. He saw her surprise. "I make it my business to know things, Ms. Grant. I'm also aware of his current legal theatrics against you. It is a distasteful affair." Madelyn's heart sank. It was over. He knew who she was, the messy, scandalous ex-wife. But Donovan's expression was not one of judgment. It was one of empathy. "Tell me about the Degas in the hallway," he said, abruptly changing the subject. Startled, Madelyn began to speak. The nervousness fell away as she talked about what she loved. She spoke of the sculpture's tension, the way Degas captured a fleeting moment of movement, the texture of the bronze. She spoke for 10 minutes passionately and knowledgeably. Donovan listened, a small smile playing on his lips. When she finished, he simply nodded. "I have a collection of early 20th century sculptures that are in disarray. They were a passion of my late wife's. I need someone to catalog them, research their provenance, and oversee their restoration and display. Someone who sees not just an object, but the story it tells. The job is yours if you want it." Madelyn was stunned. "Just like that, I have found that the most important decisions are often the simplest," he said. "You have a good eye, and more importantly, you have resilience. I admire that. The world is unkind to resilient women, Ms. Grant. It mistakes their strength for bitterness." She started the next day. The job was a sanctuary. She spent her days in a climate-controlled archive surrounded by beauty and history. Donovan Pierce was a quiet, respectful employer. He would often join her in the archive, sitting for hours just watching her work, asking gentle questions about art and her life. He never mentioned Blake. He never pried into her pain. Instead, he created a space where she could heal. He listened to her ideas, valued her opinion, and treated her as a peer. For the first time in over a decade, Madelyn felt seen. She felt like herself again. The work was meticulous and demanding, but it was hers. It was a world away from the drama of the courtroom, a quiet harbor in the storm of her life. And in that quiet harbor, an unexpected and profound friendship began to take root. The friendship between Madelyn and Donovan blossomed in the hushed reverence of the art collection. It was a relationship built on shared conversations over dusty crates and afternoon tea in his sunlit garden. He learned about the artist she had once been, the dreams she had packed away in favor of Blake's. One afternoon he led her to an unused studio on the third floor of the townhouse. It was a magnificent space with a skylight that bathed the room in a soft northern light. Canvases, brushes, and every color of paint imaginable were arranged neatly waiting. "A person's passion should not be a memory," he said simply. "It should be a practice." Tears welled in Madelyn's eyes. It was the most thoughtful gift she had ever received. In that studio she began to paint again. Tentatively at first, then with a furious, cathartic energy. She poured all her pain, her anger, and her rediscovering joy onto the canvases. Her art was no longer just pretty. It was powerful. It had a voice. Donovan was her sole audience. He would come and sit quietly watching her work, never judging, only encouraging. He saw her not as a broken thing to be fixed, but as a masterpiece being restored. Their relationship deepened into something more than friendship. It was a slow, gentle burn, a stark contrast to the wild, consuming fire of her relationship with Blake. With Donovan, she felt safe. She felt cherished. He loved her for her mind, for her resilience, for the scars she bore. He was a man who had built his own vast private empire in finance, a world far more ruthless than Blake's, yet he moved through it with a quiet grace and an unshakable moral compass. He was everything Blake pretended to be. The lawsuit was a constant dark cloud on the horizon. As the court date approached, Madelyn grew more anxious. Donovan saw the toll it was taking on her. "Let my legal team handle this," he offered one evening. "They can make this disappear, Madelyn. We can bury him in counterclaims and litigation for the rest of his miserable life." Madelyn shook her head, a stubborn set to her jaw. "No. This is my fight. If I let you fight it for me, I'm just trading one powerful man for another. I need to do this myself. I need to walk out of that courtroom on my own 2 feet, knowing I faced him and I didn't break." Donovan looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound respect. "I understand," he said. "But you will not face him alone. You just won't see me standing beside you." A week before the trial, on a crisp autumn afternoon in the garden, he turned to her. "Madelyn Grant, you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known. You have walked through fire and emerged not burned, but forged. I am not a young man, and I have no time to waste on frivolous things. I love you. I want to spend the rest of my days making sure you never doubt your own worth again. Marry me." It wasn't a flashy proposal. There was no bended knee or diamond ring thrust in her face. It was a quiet, sincere declaration, a vow offered from one heart to another. Madelyn looked at this kind, honorable man who had given her back her soul, and she saw her future. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Donovan, I will." They were married 2 days later at City Hall with 2 of his household staff as witnesses. It was simple, private, and perfect. Madelyn wanted no fanfare. This marriage wasn't a performance for society. It was a private pact. She became Madelyn Pierce. For legal reasons, they decided to keep the marriage a secret until after the trial. Donovan's lawyers advised it would be a more powerful move. It would allow Blake to walk into his own trap to build his case on the false premise of her poverty and isolation. It was a strategic masterstroke, a checkmate in waiting. "He will see you as a helpless victim," Donovan had said, signing the marriage license with a firm hand. "He will smirk and posture, believing he holds all the cards. He will not realize the entire game has changed." So Madelyn entered the courtroom not as Madelyn Grant, the destitute ex-wife, but as Mrs. Donovan Pierce, a woman of immense unseen power. She let Blake have his moment. She let him and his lawyer paint their picture of her as a pathetic, vengeful woman. She endured the humiliation and the lies, her calm demeanor a mask for the triumphant secret she held. Every smirk Blake sent her way was a gift. He was tightening the noose around his own neck, completely unaware that she was the one holding the rope. The courtroom wasn't her execution chamber. It was his. The final day of the trial felt like a fever dream. Blake's lawyer, Walter Harding, was in his element, pacing before the judge's bench like a caged tiger about to be fed. He presented his final pieces of evidence, printed out comments from Madelyn's blog from anonymous users speculating that the tyrant in her posts was a famous CEO. He presented financial statements showing the modest ad revenue her blog generated, framing it as a desperate cash grab. "She profited from her lies, Your Honor," Harding declared, his voice ringing with theatrical indignation. "She monetized her bitterness." Jessica Riley did her best to counter. She argued for freedom of expression, for the therapeutic power of writing. She pointed out the lack of any direct name or company mentioned. But she was a rowboat against a battleship. Harding's arguments were insidious, playing on the common perception of the scorned woman. Through it all, Madelyn sat with a composure that was unnerving. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a play in which she was a character. She could feel Blake's eyes on her, willing her to cry, to object, to show any sign of weakness. His arrogance was a physical presence in the room, so thick she could almost taste it. He wanted to see her crumble. He needed it. His entire sense of self was built upon the foundation of her supposed inferiority. "Your Honor," Jessica said in her closing statement, her voice trembling slightly but full of conviction. "Mr. Morrison is not the victim here. He is a wealthy and powerful man using the legal system to bully and silence his ex-wife, a woman he left with next to nothing. This lawsuit is a continuation of the emotional and financial control he exerted during their marriage. It is a sham, and it should be dismissed." Harding simply chuckled as he sat down. The case was in the bag. Judge Coleman looked over her spectacles, her gaze moving from Jessica to Harding and finally settling on Madelyn. The silence in the room stretched for an unbearable minute. Blake leaned forward in his seat, his smirk locked in place, a victor anticipating the spoils. "Miss Grant," the judge said, her voice unexpectedly soft. "This court is sympathetic to the emotional complexities following a divorce. However, the line between personal expression and public defamation can be a thin one. Before I make my ruling, there are a few procedural matters to update for the record." This was it, the bureaucratic finale. Blake relaxed back in his chair, ready for the show to end. "The court requires a current address for all parties involved." The judge continued, looking at some papers. "Ms. Grant, the address we have on file for you is apartment 4C 2115 West Elm Street. Is that still correct?" This was the part Blake was looking forward to, the public confirmation of her reduced circumstances. Madelyn took a steadying breath. This was the moment Donovan's lawyers had prepared her for, the linchpin of their entire strategy. "No, Your Honor." Madelyn said, her voice clear and steady, ringing out in the quiet room. "It is not." The judge looked up. "Please provide the court with your current address. My legal residence is number 7 East 72nd Street, New York," Madelyn stated. A ripple went through the courtroom. Even Harding looked up, a flicker of confusion on his face. Number 7 East 72nd Street wasn't an apartment building. It was one of the most famous and exclusive private townhouses in the city, a limestone mansion known to be the reclusive home of the legendary financier Donovan Pierce. It was a fortress of old money and untouchable power. Blake's smirk faltered. He shot a confused look at Harding, who was now frowning, looking through his own files as if he'd missed something crucial. Judge Coleman's eyes sharpened with interest. "I see. And the court has your legal name as Madelyn Grant. Is that still correct?" Blake's face was a mask of disbelief. He knew that address. Everyone in their world knew that address. It didn't make any sense. "No, Your Honor." Madelyn said, the words feeling like wings in her mouth. "Upon my recent marriage, I have legally taken my husband's name." "And what is that name for the record?" the judge asked, her pen poised. Madelyn turned her head slightly, her eyes locking directly with Blake's for the first time that day. She let him see the quiet triumph in her gaze as she delivered the final fatal blow. "My name," she said, her voice resonating with a strength he had never heard before, "is Madelyn Pierce." The smirk on Blake Morrison's face did not just fade, it shattered. The name hung in the air of courtroom 3B like a detonation. Pierce. For a moment there was absolute silence. Then a frantic whispering erupted from the few spectators in the gallery. Walter Harding's face, usually a mask of smug composure, had gone slack with shock. He stared at Madelyn as if she had just sprouted wings and a halo. But all Madelyn watched was Blake. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, sickly pallor. His jaw, which had been set in a triumphant smirk moments before, was now hanging slightly open. His eyes, wide with disbelief, darted from Madelyn to his lawyer and then to the judge, searching for some sign that this was a joke, a bizarre, impossible dream. Judge Coleman, however, was all business. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a new, keen intensity in her eyes. She had presided over cases involving the city's elite for 20 years. She understood precisely what had just happened. The entire landscape of the trial had been seismically altered. Mrs. Pierce, the judge, clarified the honorific landing like a hammer blow on Blake. "Yes, Your Honor," Jessica Riley said, standing up. For the first time, she looked as formidable as her opponent. She had been in on the secret all along, and the relief and triumph on her face were palpable. "My client was married last week. We have the official certificate here for the court's records, should you wish to see it." She slid a document across the table. The bailiff retrieved it and handed it up to the judge. Judge Coleman examined it for a moment, then looked down at the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Harding," she said, her voice laced with steel, "were you aware of this development?" Harding, for the first time in his storied career, was speechless. He opened and closed his mouth like a fish. No, Your Honor. We were not." "I see," the judge said dryly. Blake finally found his voice, a strangled, incredulous rasp. "It's a lie. She's lying. She's a nobody. She works for him. She's probably his maid. Mr. Morrison, you will be silent, or I will have you removed for contempt." The judge snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. Blake flinched back as if he'd been physically struck. Judge Coleman turned her attention back to the case at hand, but her entire perspective had clearly shifted. She was no longer looking at a frivolous but straightforward case of a wealthy man suing his impoverished ex-wife. She was now looking at a wealthy man suing the wife of Donovan Pierce. Donovan Pierce was not just rich, he was an institution. He was a phantom in the world of high finance, a man who never sought the spotlight but whose influence was legendary. He could make or break global markets with a single phone call. To be in his orbit was a privilege. To be his enemy was corporate suicide. And Blake Morrison had just spent weeks and hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees publicly persecuting his wife. "Mr. Harding," the judge said, her voice dangerously calm, "your entire case for damages rests on the alleged harm done to your client's reputation by Mrs. Pierce's blog. A blog where it has been established she never once mentions him by name. Your Honor, the implication is clear." Harding began trying to recover. "What is clear?" "Counselor," the judge cut him off, "is that your client has brought this suit against a woman he believed to be vulnerable and without resources. Now, considering the defendant's change in circumstance, this court has to wonder about the true motivation behind this lawsuit. It begins to look less like a defense of reputation and more like a campaign of personal harassment." Blake's breathing was shallow now, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. He was seeing his future unravel in real time. The deals he had pending, the credit lines his company depended on, the powerful friends who would abandon him in a heartbeat rather than risk the displeasure of a man like Pierce. He had picked a fight with a stray cat only to discover it was a tiger. Furthermore, the judge continued, her eyes fixed on Blake. Any perceived damage to Mr. Morrison's reputation from this anonymous blog now pales in comparison to the very real, very public damage he has inflicted upon himself by pursuing this vindictive and meritless action against the wife of one of this city's most respected figures. I imagine the business pages will have a field day with this. That was it, the final nail. It wasn't just a legal defeat. It was a public relations nightmare that would decimate him. He had built his brand on being a winner, a ruthless but respected shark. Now he would be known as the fool who tried to bully a billionaire's wife over a blog. The judge looked at Madelyn, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Pierce, this court apologizes for the distress these proceedings have caused you." She then turned her gaze back to Harding. "This case is dismissed with prejudice. I am also inclined to entertain a motion from the defense for the plaintiff to cover all of Mrs. Pierce's legal fees. I suggest you advise your client against any further action." She banged the gavel. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Court is adjourned. As the judge swept out of the room, Madelyn slowly rose to her feet. She felt light, as if a physical weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Jessica hugged her tightly. Across the aisle, Blake sat frozen in his chair, his face the color of ash. His empire was not just shaking, it was collapsing, and he had brought the walls down on himself with a single arrogant smirk. The sound of Judge Coleman's gavel was not just an end to the proceedings, it was the starting pistol for Blake Morrison's spectacular demise. The moment court was adjourned, the room, which had been held in a state of suspended shock, erupted. Walter Harding, pale and sweating, scrambled to pack his briefcase, avoiding Blake's frantic, desperate gaze. He knew a public relations Chernobyl when he saw one. There was no spinning this. This was a career-defining catastrophe. "What do we do?" Blake hissed, grabbing his lawyer's arm. "We appeal. We sue her for fraud." Harding pulled his arm away, his professional mask crumbling to reveal the terrified man beneath. "There's nothing to appeal, Blake. The case was dismissed with prejudice. It's over. And if you know what's good for you, you'll stay as far away from Mrs. Pierce and her husband as humanly possible." The use of her new name was deliberate, a final sharp twist of the knife. As they exited the courtroom, they were met by a flash flood of reporters. They had likely been tipped off by Donovan's people, who had anticipated the verdict and prepared the battlefield. Microphones were shoved in Blake's face. Camera flashes exploded like mortar shells, capturing every flicker of panic and rage on his ashen face. "Mr. Morrison, is it true you were unaware of your ex-wife's marriage to Donovan Pierce? Was this lawsuit an act of personal vengeance? How will this affect investor confidence in Morrison Logistics?" He was buffeted by the crowd, blinded by the lights, deafened by the questions. He had walked into this courthouse a king, expecting to watch a public execution. Now he was the one being torn apart by the mob, his humiliation broadcast for the world to see. The fallout was a financial and social avalanche. The headlines were merciless, painting him as a vindictive fool. That very afternoon, the stock of Morrison Logistics didn't just dip, it cliff-dived. Panicked shareholders, terrified of being on the wrong side of Donovan Pierce, started a massive sell-off. Billions in market capitalization vanished in a matter of hours. Blake sat in his silent glass-walled office, watching the stock ticker on the news, a cascade of red numbers that represented the digital disintegration of his life's work. The calls began almost immediately. His primary lenders, the banks that had financed his aggressive expansion, suddenly called in their loans, citing reputational risk. Members of the boardmen who had clapped him on the back just a week ago now spoke to him in clipped, cold tones. They called an emergency meeting for the following morning. Blake walked into the boardroom, the room where he had made his name as a ruthless visionary, and was met with a wall of stony faces. They didn't even bother with pleasantries. The chairman, a man Blake had personally installed, read from a prepared statement. "In light of recent events which have exposed the company to significant financial and reputational harm, the board has lost confidence in your leadership. Pursuant to Section 4B of your employment contract, the Morals and Public Disparagement Clause, we are exercising our right to terminate your position as CEO and chairman effective immediately." "You can't do this." Blake stammered the words, feeling foreign in his mouth. He was the one who fired people. He was the one who wielded the axe. "We already have," the chairman said, sliding a box across the polished mahogany table. "Your personal effects from your office. Security will escort you from the building." Humiliation burned a hot track up his neck. He was being frog-marched out of his own empire. As he was led through the lobby past the giant gleaming Morrison Logistics sign, he saw his employees staring, whispering. He had been a god to them, feared and respected. Now he was a spectacle. His personal life crumbled just as quickly. Tiffany was waiting for him at the condo, her suitcases already packed. "I saw the news," she said, not a trace of sympathy in her voice. "This is a disaster, Blake. It's a setback," he pleaded. "I can fix this. We can fix this." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "There is no we. I signed up to be the wife of a titan, not a pariah. I'm sorry, Blake, but I have to protect my own interests." She slipped the massive diamond ring off her finger and placed it on a marble countertop. It clinked softly, a final definitive sound. The woman he had left Madelyn for was in the end just a reflection of himself, transactional, ambitious, and utterly devoid of loyalty. He was left in the echoing silence of the condo, a monument to a life that no longer existed. He was a social leper. Invitations were rescinded. Calls went unreturned. The powerful men who once sought his counsel now acted as if he didn't exist. He had built his world on the shifting sands of power and fear, and overnight the tide had gone out, leaving him stranded and alone. Meanwhile, Madelyn was breathing freely for the first time in years. She and Donovan retreated to his sprawling estate in the Hudson Valley, a world away from the noise and judgment of the city. There, amidst the fiery colors of the autumn leaves, the tight knot of anxiety she had carried for so long finally began to unwind. She walked for hours in the woods, painted with a fervor she hadn't felt since she was a student, and spent long evenings by the fire talking with a man who cherished her voice. He had orchestrated the media response with quiet, surgical precision, but he never once gloated about Blake's downfall. When she tentatively brought it up one evening, he simply took her hand. "His choices led him to his consequences, Madelyn. That has nothing to do with you anymore. Your life is about what you create, not what he destroyed." His words were a gift, releasing her from any lingering sense of responsibility for Blake's fate. In that quiet sanctuary, she didn't just heal. She transformed. The haunted, hesitant woman who had walked into that courtroom was replaced by a serene, confident artist. With Donovan's full support, she began planning her next chapter. She didn't want a life of idle leisure. She wanted a life of purpose. She envisioned a gallery not just as a business, but as a mission. A place to champion emerging artists, especially women who were struggling to be seen and heard. She called it Phoenix Gallery. The opening was the talk of the New York art scene. It was a beautiful, triumphant night. Madelyn moved through the crowded room not as Donovan Pierce's wife, but as the gallery's owner and curator, her knowledge and passion evident to everyone she spoke with. She felt a profound sense of peace. She had built this. Her name was on the wall not as an attachment to a powerful man, but as a testament to her own vision. Months later, on a bitterly cold afternoon in December, Madelyn was arranging a new exhibit. Snow was beginning to fall, dusting the streets of Soho in a soft white blanket. She glanced out the large plate-glass window of her gallery and saw him. Blake was hurrying along the sidewalk, hunched inside a coat that seemed too big for him. He was gaunt, his face pale and unshaven, the trademark arrogance completely stripped away. He stopped for a moment, looking into the warm, bright light of her gallery. He saw the vibrant art, the people inside laughing and talking. He saw a world of life and creation. Then his eyes lifted and met hers. For a long, silent moment they just looked at each other through the glass. In his eyes she saw the full scope of his ruin. It was a hollow, desolate emptiness. But she also saw something else. A flicker of the ambitious, hungry young man she had fallen in love with in a college library, and a deep, aching regret for the path he had chosen. A brief pang of sadness for that long-lost boy touched her heart, but it was fleeting. It was a memory like a photograph from another life. He broke eye contact first, turning away and shuffling down the street, disappearing into the swirling snow in the faceless crowd. He was a ghost, a cautionary tale. Madelyn watched him go, then turned back to the painting she was hanging. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Donovan. "Thinking of you. Can't wait for you to come home." She smiled a genuine, radiant smile. Her life was full of warmth and love, purpose, and beauty. Blake Morrison was just a stranger on the street, a cold shadow from a past she had long since left behind. Her future was here inside these walls, and beyond them a masterpiece of her own making. What a story of karmic justice. It's a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about the power you wield over others, but the resilience you find within yourself. Madelyn's journey from a broken ex-wife to a triumphant, powerful woman shows us that the end of one story is often the beginning of a much better one. Blake thought his wealth and arrogance made him invincible, but he forgot the most important rule: never underestimate a person who has nothing left to lose. She didn't just survive his cruelty, she used it as fuel to rise from the ashes and build a life he could only dream of. It just goes to show you that sometimes the best revenge isn't loud and flashy, but quiet, successful, and utterly transformative. What did you think of Madelyn's incredible comeback? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of justice being served, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and make sure you subscribe to the channel for more dramatic real-life stories. Thanks for listening.